Thanks for having me. Really good to be with you all. As Lindsay said, I'm Mike Sloan. I'm the Director of Safeguarding at GRACE. If you didn't hear, GRACE is a long, clunky acronym for Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. We're a nonprofit Christian ministry. We have a very simple goal, and that goal is to educate and empower churches to recognize, prevent, and respond to abuse. We've existed as an organization for about 20 years. I've worked full-time with GRACE 7 or 8 years, a little bit longer part-time, but I've been doing this kind of work for about 14 years, helping churches with training, policy development, and doing consultation with churches when churches are often in the weeds of very difficult situations, whether that's allegations or caring for survivors or other related situations. My background is I was a pastor for about 10 years, and then, as I said, overlapping with that, I've been doing this work for about 14 years. So really glad to be with you. I come from Virginia, so drove over yesterday from Lynchburg, Virginia. Nice drive, and again, thanks for having me. Very simple goal for this training. The very simple goal is to give you as leaders practical education and practical tools to think about how to cultivate and further a strong culture of protection here for the vulnerable. So very simple goal. And what we're going to do is, I'll say a few preliminary things here, but we'll get into a lot of interaction today. We'll get into a framework that we've created for leaders, that the goal of this framework is for you to, and you're already doing wonderful things as a church in this regard, but the framework we're going to give you is a framework that's designed for you to continue to further that strong culture that's needed. Leaders really make the difference in setting an effective culture for both prevention of abuse and response to abuse. So that's going to be our focus today, both prevention and response. A few things logistically, we're going to take breaks about on the hour, maybe a little bit more. Our lunch break scheduled for 11:30, and we're going to wrap up on time at 1:30. I know it's a church event, but we're going to end on time. And just a couple of things before we dive in. One is self-care is so important when we talk about something so weighty and heavy as abuse. And in a room of really any size, there's going to be survivors of abuse present. So if you are a survivor, for one thing, just know no one today is going to be put on the spot in regard to your personal story of abuse. It's very important that a survivor is free to talk about their story only when they're ready to do it, when they feel safe to do that with someone they trust. And that's important for us to know as leaders, to not put people on the spot about their story before they're ready to talk about it. But of course, we are going to have heavy conversation today. Nothing in the training's intentionally graphic or shocking. You're not going to see pictures of children with bruises or anything like that. That said, because we're humans and God has designed us as whole people, this is going to weigh upon us emotionally, mentally, spiritually, physically. So I just want to give you full permission to take care of yourself. And if you need to take a break and we're not on a break, it's not going to bother me one bit. Please do so. If you need to just stand around at the side or the back and stretch or move around, please do so. If you want to use some strategies that you've learned to try to stay calm and present, please do so. Some of the ones that I've learned from some of the most committed Christians I know, who often also happen to be trauma counselors and trauma therapists, are just doing some slow, deep breathing, holding a cup of hot tea or coffee in your hand. Like, a lot of us know that's comforting, but there's an actual physiological response in our bodies for why that's comforting. And trauma therapists will no, it actually affects blood flow and other things that kind of helps keep you calm and present. Water or any liquid, just swishing it around in your mouth and swallowing can help keep us calm and present. Those are some of the strategies I use the most when we're talking about hard things. So again, please use those. And again, take a break if you need to. But that said, nothing in the training isn't intentionally intended to be shocking or graphic or anything of that nature. All right, the introductory part of the training is we're just going to talk about this idea that we as leaders make the difference and setting that type of culture related to abuse that's needed for effective prevention and response. We're going to talk through some basics, basic definitions, basic dynamics, and we're going to use some scenarios to talk about common realities of abuse to make sure we're on the same page. And then we're going to use a scenario to talk about prevention. Because of course, as leaders, we are highly invested in preventing abuse. We want to respond well, of course, but if at all possible, we want to stop it from ever happening, right? So we want to talk about how prevention works. And then we'll end that introductory part of the training with that leadership framework. It's a 4-part framework that we've created for leaders that are we think the 4 essential areas in furthering that strong culture of protection. And that's going to be our outline, that 4-part framework for the rest of the training from that point on. Okay, so that's where we're going. And let me just say this. Some of you are note takers like me, and I just want to assure you, all of these slides are going to be made available to you, so take any notes you need to, but know all the slides are going to be made available for you, okay? Along with other resources too. All right. I'm going to start with a quote from a researcher on abuse, Dr. Anna Salter. She says this. She says, look, offenders can recognize ideal settings for abuse even if the rest of us can't. And what she's getting at there, and by the way, she went to prison after prison and interviewed offenders, those who abused, those who were violent. And one of her main conclusions out of that research is this idea of intentionality. You know, for someone who is a child abuser, someone who is an intimate partner violence offender, where that's happening behind closed doors at home, that there's an intentionality behind it that a lot of us, of course, we just don't think this way because we're not that type of person who would ever think about harming people in that way. So it's important, and she says, look, it's precisely this lack of understanding, this lack of knowledge that can give those types of people an edge. And I know that's a really heavy thought to start with, that intentionality, but I would argue that is exactly a similar point that Jesus made in the Bible. So in Matthew 10, Jesus said, behold, I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. And by the way, what's the point of that metaphor? Wolves and sheep? Wolves act in a what kind of way? A predatory way towards who? The sheep, who are by definition more vulnerable, right? And of course, he's using a common metaphor of that world to talk about people, right? And notice what Jesus says. Be the furthest thing from a wolf. That's why he says, be a dove. That's like the furthest animal away, right, from a predatory animal. But that's not all he says. He says we are to be wise as serpents. We're to understand the world. We're to be proactive. We're not to be reactive, essentially. And that gives me a lot of comfort as a Christian, because I think Jesus essentially is making the same point that Dr. Salter was making. We have to understand this. And leaders especially, we have a responsibility to understand this and work against it. Another famous statement Jesus made in Matthew 7, the famous statement about beware of the one who's like a wolf in sheep's clothing, right? Well, I don't know if you've ever thought about it this way, but that is Jesus teaching basic abuse dynamics. That's what he's doing. That's what Dr. Salter and others teach today. Someone who is known, someone who's, think about what he's saying. He's talking about someone who has, in this case, a false teacher, right? It's a leadership position. It's someone who walks into the faith community. Everyone knows and everyone expects to be there. So Jesus didn't have to warn us about the person who walks in and says, I'm here to gobble up your children, bring them to me. You know, he's not having to warn us about that, right? He's warning about someone who is among us, who's known, who has, in this case, a position of power and trust. within the whole community. And the wolf in sheep's clothing bit, what he's getting at there is that there is an intentional, calculated deception of the community. Why that person is there is different. It's different from everyone else. And yet they're blending in as if they're there for the same reason as everyone else. In faith communities, we're here to know God, to worship God, to love God, and love neighbor. But there are people, bad actors, who are a part of faith communities who are there for a different reason, but they keep that typically carefully hidden. Do you see that's the core reality of what abuse is? And that's the reality we have to work against as leaders. It's not as straightforward as looking around and saying, oh, there's the bad person, let's deal with them. Unfortunately, it's not that straightforward. Let me just mention the famous case we've all heard of. Do you remember Larry Nassar, the doctor? Okay, he's the one who abused, we think, likely hundreds of victims at USA Gymnastics and at Michigan State University. And to kind of pick do you remember the survivors who bravely testified at his sentencing that made national news? And some of us saw the actual testimony. Many of those amazing survivors made this very simple, very profound point. They said, look, Larry's being held accountable now as an individual, but we also need the institutions who enabled him for years to be accountable. That's a very simple but a very profound point. How can it be that 8 individual victims had come forward at Michigan State and still he's in his office seeing children and young people? How does that happen? We could call that a what? A culture of what? A culture of enabling, right? Leaders aren't being responsible. How can 14 upper-level administrators have credible knowledge of these very serious allegations and still Larry's in his office seeing young people and children? How does that happen? Okay, so that's an easy, obvious, bad example, right? But positively, what are we called to as leaders? We're called to a strong culture of protection where that doesn't happen, where we're doing all we can proactively, and we're much more responsive when there is a need to intervene and bring safety when credible allegations come forward. So we're going to be working on those issues. There's another researcher, Dr. Jennifer Fried. She talks about the betrayal that victims often experience in an institution. And this is something we've talked to many survivors about over the years personally, directly. And they say, look, the abuse was horrific, but the worst part for me is when my church didn't help me after. It's when my church tried to minimize it or put blame on me. That was actually the part that hurt the most. Dr. Fry talks about institutional betrayal as a second form of harm, second form of after abuse has happened. But again, I want to go to the positive here. What she's calling us to, all of us to, she says what we need is what she calls institutional courage. She says that's an institution's commitment to seek the truth and engage in moral action despite unpleasantness, risk, and short-term cost. It's a pledge to protect and care for those who depend on the institution. As Christians, can we get behind that mentality? That honestly, I don't think she's writing from a Christian perspective, but that sounds a lot like words from the Bible about carrying others' burdens, seeking justice, seeking truth. So that's a very powerful framework. One of our founding board members, Diane Langberg, some of you might have heard of her book. She's written a lot of really good books in this area. She says, look, predators will recognize systems where leadership will prioritize the system over the individual. And as a Christian, again, I think it cuts right to the heart of this issue for us as leaders, is why are we here? What are we ultimately about? what was Jesus ultimately about, right? It was about people. The church is what? It's not budgets and buildings, and at the end of the day, it is. We have to have meetings about those things, and that's, again, I was in those meetings. It's fine. But at the end of the day, what is the church? And what are our priorities? It has to be the vulnerable and each person. And that's why we're here. The church is an assembly. It's people, right? And here's the good news. Faith communities, we can be part of, you can go ahead, Bobby. Yeah. We see a lot of hard stories and harm, but we also see really good stories. We see churches stepping up to get better training, put better things in place, and we can be a part of the solution. So there is a lot of, I want you to be out of this training. It's going to be heavy. There's no way to avoid that. But I do want you to leave here. My goal is for you to leave here empowered and encouraged. We can do this. We can make progress. We can be and further the culture of safety, respect, protection that we need, that Jesus is calling us to be. All right. Let's just take a breath for a moment and do a little bit of work on getting on the same page with a foundation. What is abuse? What are the common realities and dynamics? So in church, we say things like what? We are all sinners. Amen? Amen. At the same time, I would say it's important that we also say abuse is not a sin like other sins. It's a very destructive, egregious, damaging form of sin. So here's a general definition of sin. Of abuse. In general, abuse occurs when a person holding power and trust uses that power and trust to exploit or violate a person who is more vulnerable. So at the core of what it is, it involves power over someone more vulnerable, and it's usually a known relationship because there's trust involved. And studies bring that back over and over again, that it's overwhelming all forms of abuse. Now, can it be from a stranger? Of course it can be, and sometimes is. But the vast majority, over 90%, maybe even 95%, depending on the type of abuse, is by someone known and trusted. And you see, even in this general definition, why I would say it's a very destructive form of sin. Because the very vehicle for the exploitation is in a relationship where there should have been protection. There should have been safety and respect and trust. So whether it's a coach or a parent or a teacher or a pastor, there's a relationship where there should have been care and protection and valuing of the person, and that becomes weaponized, and that is used, the trust, the relationship, the power is used to exploit, to violate in some way. And of course, it can be any way we're human. Abuse can come in any form that we're human. So it can be physical, it can be spiritual. Often it's more than one type at the same time. Financial, emotional, sexual, etc. Without, we're going to see a lot of what the Bible says today. But let me just stop and go to one verse to show that the Bible really gets this core dynamic of power, especially. In Ecclesiastes 4, there's this lament. A lament, of course, is that heart cry to God in that feeling of a hard situation, feeling powerless very often. And it says, against all the oppressions. And that's the more common, do you guys use a version here? Do you use ESV, NIV, or a particular version? Or is it all over the place? Your KJV only? Okay, wonderful. Excellent.
I preach from the NLT.
Okay, NLT. Great. A lot of our translations, the word oppression is the word that overlaps with our kind of modern usage of that word abuse very often. Often, though, in the Bible, the oppression is used for interpersonal types of abuses, like assault or physical violence. It's also used for more systemic forms of violence and oppression, like slavery. When the Egyptians enslaved the Israelites, it talks about that oppression. But here there's a general lament about the oppressions that are done under the sun. And behold, the tears of the oppressed. They had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors, there was power, and there was no one to comfort them. Do you see? The lament is coming from people who have power are weaponizing that power against people who are in the oppression, powerless to stop it. And so they're crying out to God in that feeling of powerlessness. So that's an example. A critical distinction in all abuse that we must get right as leaders is that abuse is not two people sinning. Now, as a Christian, as a former pastor, I know two people can sin together. That's not the issue. But abuse is not about two people sinning together. It's one person sinning against another person. It's about someone sinning and someone being sinned against. That's why we use the language of perpetrator and victim. And I know personally some survivors, they don't like that terminology of victim. Of course, we should respect that whenever possible. But the idea in that language, that's why we would use words like perpetrator or victim, because it's trying to get at that dynamic that this is someone choosing to harm someone else, and this is someone being acted upon, and it is not their fault. Now, what's critical here is if we don't get that deep in our bones, we will do harm as leaders. Because we're going to, in our response, even if it's a minority or a small percentage trying to put blame or responsibility upon the victim, that does tremendous damage. That does tremendous harm. So we just need to be aware of that. All right. You were given a handout, and if you read ahead, I apologize. You read that without any context whatsoever, without any kind of easing into it. But what I want to do now, and before we read the scenario, I want to just practice recognizing these common dynamics of abuse together. Again, I think this is just helpful to make sure we're all on the same page in developing language and an understanding of what abuse often is. And most of these common dynamics on the slide, you have, I've already mentioned them. So like in Jesus' words about the wolf in sheep's clothing, someone using power over someone who's more vulnerable. It's often someone using trust, and not just trust in a personal relationship, although that's true, it's often trust within the whole community. And abuse involves very often entitlement. It's based, for adults, it's based in entitlement. I can do what I want. I can take what I want. I can use another human being in an exploitive way. And that's very dehumanizing. And, to get to that point for a human to feel I can use a child sexually, for example, for my own gratification, that takes a huge amount of arrogance and entitlement to believe you are entitled, and it's the same with an adult, not just a child, obviously. So abuse involves these attitudes that go 100% against what we're called to as Christians, to serve others, to care for others, not use or exploit others, right? A wolf versus a dove, right? Deception and manipulation is at the core. That's a core reality of almost all abuse. And that's, again, that wolf in sheep's clothing, that double life that Jesus was getting at. And notice, again, that's not just within the perpetrator targeting of potential victim. That's often, again, in a whole community. There is deception and manipulation at work in that reality within the broader community. Very often, abusers will use isolation and different tactics to render a victim powerless and silent. And many of those tactics are things like fear and threats, shame and guilt to keep them silent. Okay, let's look at the first scenario. And I'm going to read this. And then I'm going to ask, let's just spend 5 minutes talking to a neighbor or two And the simple thing I want you to keep in mind as I read this is, do you see these dynamics in this little story? So think about those dynamics, that slide, as I read this, and then we'll talk about it. We'll talk about it together, but I want you to spend at least 5 minutes talking to a neighbor. All right, here's the scenario. A middle school student seeks out the help of his student pastor regarding his depression. The student's parents are getting divorced, and he's taking this very hard. The pastor gets the parents' permission to meet regularly with the student to talk, do Bible study, and pray. Eventually, the pastor convinces him to do counseling sessions, quote unquote, and Bible study in the nude with him. The student pastor gradually exposes the student to explicit videos and then sexual contact. The pastor tells the student that they have sinned together, but God will forgive their sin. The student pastor prays for forgiveness together and then tells the student, God will forgive you if you trust him completely. Trust God and do not talk about it ever again, because you are forgiven. In the Bible, it says that God will remember our sins no more. This means you cannot speak of them because they are gone. The student pastor goes on to say that he can't tell anyone or God will revoke his forgiveness, and also the ministry might fail and people will go to hell because of him. The student is confused by all of this. He trusts this pastor, and the student feels guilty, embarrassed, and too scared to tell anyone. All right. Turn to a neighbor. Do you see those dynamics at work in the story? Which ones stand out to you?